Hey Summoners, ready to break down League of Legends patch 14.20. We're going deep into the changes hitting the Rift. Especially, you know, those juicy updates to champions and items, and trust me, there are a lot. Think of this as your cheat sheet to understanding how the game's about to shift.
Absolutely. Patch 14.20 is all about fine-tuning. After the Split 3 shakeup, Riot's trying to address some of the imbalances that emerged, and there are definitely some winners and losers in this patch.
Okay, let's dive in. First up, League is turning 15. Can you believe it? To celebrate, Riot's throwing a massive party, and you're invited.
It's going to be epic. 10 days of rewards just for playing one game each day. We're talking Mythic Essence, Blue Essence, Orange Essence, a special anniversary icon, emotes, even a border, and the grand prize, a Mythic and Silversary skin.
Whoa, Mythic skin. Just for logging in and playing a game, Riot's really spoiling us. Plus, there's a dev Q&A live stream on October 9th with fun events like Chat Builds a Champ. I always love seeing what crazy ideas the community comes up with.
Me too. And there are themed days, focusing on community creativity, music, and esports. It's a full-blown celebration of everything we love about League.
Definitely sounds like a can't-miss event. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of the patch notes, we've had a request from a listener to focus specifically on changes to items and champions. So let's jump right into the thick of it.
That sounds good to me. One of the biggest changes this patch is aimed at crit ADCs. They've been struggling a bit compared to other classes, especially in the early game. Riot's trying to remedy that with some significant adjustments to their core items.
Okay, let's break it down. What exactly are they doing with these items?
Well, they're making Collector and Yentl Wild Arrows, two popular crit items, much more affordable. This means crit ADCs can hit their power spikes earlier and be more competitive in the early game.
So, are we going to see Collector and Yentl Wild Arrows becoming the go-to first items for crit ADCs now?
It's definitely possible. They're still dependent on crit chance to really shine, but that lower price tag makes them way more appealing as a first buy.
Interesting. What about Static Shiv and Essence Reaver? Any changes there?
Yep. Static Shiv, which was overperforming, is getting a slight nerf to its attack speed. And Essence Reaver is getting a price reduction as well, but it's also getting some stat reductions to compensate.
Got it. So, it seems like Riot's trying to make all of these crit ADC items more viable options for that first item purchase. But how do these item changes actually play out in the game?
Yeah.
Especially in conjunction with the champion changes.
Well, let's take Aphelios as an example. He was hit pretty hard by the Collector nerfs in the last patch.
Right. He definitely felt a lot weaker.
Exactly. But this time around, he's getting some love, with buffs to both his base health and the bonus attack damage he gets from his passive.
So he'll be a bit tankier in the early game and have a bit more bite to his attacks, especially with those cheaper crit items.
Precisely. And then you have Caitlyn, who's also getting some buffs.
What are they doing for?
They're giving her a slight increase to her attack speed ratio and a boost to the damage her Q deals to secondary targets. They're basically leaning into her strengths as a lane bully and a late game hyper carry.
I can already see her dominating bot lane with those changes. Now, speaking of lane bullies, Corki's getting some attention too.
He is. And these changes are pretty significant. They're reducing the mana cost on his Q&E, which means he can spam those abilities more freely in lane. And to really amp up his damage, they're adding a bonus AD ratio to his W.
Wow. Those are some spicy buffs for Corki. Sounds like he'll be a lot less reliant on mana and much more of a threat in lane.
Exactly. It seems like Riot is really pushing for crit ADCs to have a stronger presence in the early game with these item and champion changes.
Makes sense. It'll be interesting to see how the meta evolves and whether other strategies emerge to counter these buffed up ADCs.
But definitely. But it's not all sunshine and rainbows for everyone. Some champions are getting hit with the nerf bat this patch, and we need to talk about them.
All right. Bring on the nerfs, whose reign of terror is coming to an end.
Well, Dr. Mundo, for one, he's been a real menace in the top lane, becoming near unkillable with his insane healing and damage.
Yeah, he's been pretty tough to deal with.
Riot's trying to clip his cleavers. By hitting the bonus AD on his E, this means he won't be able to bully quite as hard in lane, giving opponents a fighting chance.
Makes sense. It'll be interesting to see if this nerf brings him back down to earth. Who else is facing the music this patch?
Jaehin, another powerhouse champion, is also getting nerfed. His late game power is being targeted. They're reducing both his AD growth and the damage on his ultimate.
So he won't be quite as much of a late game monster.
Exactly. And then you have Lee Sin, who's been struggling lately.
Yeah, He hasn't been as dominant as he used to be.
Right, so to give him a little boost, they're increasing his base AD, which should give his early game a bit more punch.
Okay. So we've covered the crit ADC buffs,
Yeah.
but it seems like there are a lot more champion changes to unpack.
There are. And we're just getting started. We still need to talk about some of the champions who are currently dominating the meta and how Riot's planning to balance them out. Let's talk about Mordekaiser. He's been a real terror in the top lane. And Riot's taking notice. They're reducing the bonus damage on his Q, which was a big part of his oppressive laning phase.
So they're trying to make him a little less overwhelming in those early exchanges.
Exactly. Now, I know a lot of Nyla players have been asking for this. They're finally reducing the cast time on her E2 instant. This is huge for her because it makes her so much smoother to play.
That's a big quality of life change. I bet Nyla mains are rejoicing. Now, what about Pantheon? I saw he's getting some love this patch.
He is. They're increasing the damage on his W, which should be particularly helpful for players who haven't quite mastered all the nuances of his kit.
Interesting. So it's a buff that's targeted
Yeah.
towards making him more accessible for newer players. Now let's talk about Poppy. She's been a bit of a powerhouse in the support role lately, hasn't she?
Oh, yeah. She has. Her high damage output has been a bit much, so Riot's increasing the cooldown on her passive and reducing the damage on her E to bring her back in line.
Makes sense. Now let's move on to Riven. She's getting a pretty substantial rework this patch. What exactly are they changing?
They're completely reworking her Q. The damage scaling is shifting from total AD to bonus AD. This means she'll be incentivized to build more damage items, and it creates a more defined power spike for her at level 9.
Wow. That's a pretty significant change. What does this mean for Riven players in terms of their build paths and play style?
Well, it means prioritizing those AD items early on will be crucial for maximizing her damage output. You'll want to think about items like Duskblade, Yumuz, and even Ravenous Hydra. The change also opens up some interesting possibilities with her runes.
Speaking of runes, I did see that they've updated her recommended runes as well.
They have. There are some stronger options now, particularly on her Resolve page.
So Riven players definitely have some homework to do this batch, figuring out the optimal builds and rune setups.
Definitely. Now let's move on to Shyvana. She's been a bit too strong lately, especially when it comes to snowballing out of control.
What are they doing to bring her power down?
They're targeting her ability to stack AP and melt opponents. They're reducing the AP ratio on her W, the burn damage on her E in dragon form, and the AP ratio on her ultimate.
So it's a multi-pronged approach
Right.
to curbing her snowball potential.
Exactly. Now for Singed, it's a smaller nerf. He's been a bit too tanky lately, so they're reducing his armor growth slightly.
Got it. Just a little tweak to make him a bit less unkillable. What about Skarner?
Skarner's been quite strong in pro play, so they're nerfing his passive damage and the damage on his E, primarily to rein him in at that higher level of play.
Makes sense. It's always a delicate balance, trying to adjust champions so they're viable in both casual and professional play.
It is. Now for Tristana, they're actually giving her a slight buff. They're increasing the range on her E and R to match her attack range at level 1, which makes her a bit more consistent across all levels.
Nice. It's always good to see some buffs mixed in with the nerfs. What about Tryndamere? What's happening with him?
They're buffing Tryndamere. By increasing his attack speed ratio and armor growth, the goal is to improve his survivability in those shorter fights and increase his late-game DPS.
Interesting. So he'll be able to dish out more damage while also being a bit more resilient. Now, lastly, let's talk about Udyr.
Udyr's been a bit of a jungle king lately, and Riot's looking to dethrone him. They're reducing the damage his Q and R deal to monsters, which will slow down his clear speed. They're also decreasing the bonus movement speed on his E, making his ganks a bit less effective.
So it's all about slowing him down.
Yeah.
And giving his opponents a bit more breathing room.
Exactly. Oh, and 2 more champion changes we should mention. Veigar and the Yasuo duo. Veigar's getting a nerf to his W damage, specifically aimed at making it a bit easier to dodge, especially for newer players. And both Yasuo and Yaron, who were hit by the crit item changes, are getting some compensation buffs to make those crit builds more viable.
Wow. That's a lot of champion changes. We've covered buffs, nerfs, reworks, the whole gamut. It's clear that Riot is really focused on shaking things up and addressing some of the balance issues that have emerged.
Absolutely. But we're not done yet. There are still some significant changes to items and runes that we need to discuss.
All right, let's talk about those AP items. I know there were some notable tweaks happening there, especially for items that provide a lot of burst damage.
Yes. And one of the biggest targets is Liandry's Torment. It's been a dominant item, particularly for junglers who can utilize its burn damage effectively.
So what are they doing to bring it back down to earth?
They're actually using a two-pronged approach. First, they're nerfing Fated Ashes, which is the component item that builds into Liandry's. They're reducing the damage it deals to monsters, which directly impacts Liandry's clear speed for junglers.
Clever. So by hitting the component item, they're indirectly nerfing Liandry's.
Exactly. And on top of that, they're also directly nerfing Liandry's itself. They're reducing the damage per second cap it has against monsters, further hindering its effectiveness in the jungle.
So it's a double whammy for Liandry's. I'm guessing we'll see a lot fewer junglers rushing that item now.
Most likely. Now let's talk about Luden's Companion. It's getting a bit of a rework this patch.
What exactly are they doing with Luden's?
They're shifting its focus away from bursting down single targets and more towards sustained damage in teamfights. They're increasing the base damage and AP ratio on its initial hit, but reducing the damage of the repeated hits.
So it's less about nuking someone and more about providing consistent damage in larger engagements.
Exactly. This might shift Luden's to be a more popular choice for mages who thrive in teamfights, rather than those who focus on picking off isolated targets.
Interesting. And Storm Surge, another popular AP item,
Yeah.
is getting nerfed as well.
It is. They're reducing both its ability power and the damage of its squall effect. It was outshining other AP item options, so they're making room for some more diversity in build.
Makes sense. Variety is the spice of life, especially when it comes to item builds.
Absolutely. And speaking of variety, Thornmail, which has been the most popular armor item in the game, is also getting nerfed. They're reducing its armor and adjusting the thorn's damage, encouraging players to explore other armor options.
Okay, so we've kidded some major changes to both AD and AP items. Now let's talk about runes. I know there were some quality of life updates. For readability, what exactly did they do there?
They updated a bunch of runes to make them easier to read and understand, both in the in-game display panel and the end-of-game rune tab. It's a small change, but a welcome one.
Definitely. Clarity is always appreciated. Now, were there any major rune changes apart from that?
A couple stand out. Phase Rush got a minor adjustment to its range move speed calculation, but the real game changer is the Grasp of the Undying nerf.
What's happening with Grasp? I know it's been a very popular rune.
It's been a bit too popular, even for champions who aren't tanks or juggernauts, so they're refocusing it. To be more beneficial for those tanky champions, they're reducing the base healing it provides, and the max health gained per stack will be lower for ranged champions.
So they're essentially making it less appealing for squishier champions and more in line with its intended purpose for tanks and juggernauts.
Exactly. And Nimbus Cloak is getting a slight buff. They're increasing the decaying movement speed it provides, making it a bit more effective for those quick escapes or engages.
So we've covered a ton of ground here, from champion buffs and nerfs to item reworks and rune adjustments, but there's still more to talk about. We need to dive into the ARM changes, the ultimate spellbook updates, and of course, those exciting anniversary events.
We do, and believe me, there are some juicy details we don't want to miss.
All right, let's shift gears and talk about ARM. What's happening in the Abyss this patch?
Crit ADCs are getting some much-needed attention. They've been struggling in RM lately, so Riot's giving them a boost with some targeted buffs. Champions like Gwen, Misfortune, Nyla, Samira, Senna, Seraphine, and Zeri are all getting buffs to either their damage or their damage taken.
They're trying to make them a bit more potent in those chaotic ARAM team fights.
Exactly. And to further balance things out, Ari and Leona, who've been a bit too strong in ARAM, are getting some nerfs.
Makes sense. Now, are there any item changes specifically for ARAM?
There are. Static Shiv is getting a significant damage nerf to champions in ARAM, and it will also have a cooldown on its Electroshock. Plus, they're removing the ARAM-specific changes that were previously applied to Storm Surge and Sundered Sky.
Interesting. It sounds like they're trying to fine-tune the itemization for ARAM and make those crit ADCs a bit more viable. Now, what about Ultimate Spellbook? Any updates there?
Yep, they're toning down the stat boost you get for swapping Ultimate Summoners. It was a bit too strong for bruisers and tanks, making them a bit too overwhelming.
So they're reining in that extra power a bit.
Right. And finally, Y is joining the Ultimate Spellbook roster.
I know a lot of Way fans have been waiting for that.
Me too. Plus, they've fixed a bunch of bugs and quality of life issues related to alternate summoners. Things like Xerath's ultimate scaling and champions dying in Mordekaiser's Death Realm.
Always good to see them squat